Alarms tore through the command deck before I even understood what my screen was showing me. My name is Sayla Kaur, and I have served as a sensor officer on the Coalition patrol ship Aventine for 6 long cycles. In that time I have logged comets, dead moons, smugglers running dark through the border belt, and once, a swarm of ice fragments that nearly took out our forward shield array. I thought I had seen every strange thing this stretch of space could offer. I was wrong. The object appeared on my display as a single dot, drifting near the edge of the Halvith system, a region we do not officially patrol but quietly watch because of old disputes nobody wants to reopen. At first glance, it looked like debris. No power signature, no drive trail, no response to the passive scan sweep that catches even old asteroid mining beacons. I almost logged it as a rock and moved on to the next sector. Almost. Something made me run a second sweep. Call it instinct, call it boredom, call it the itch you get after years of staring at empty space and learning to notice the one thing that does not belong. I narrowed the beam and sent a tighter pulse toward the object. The return came back wrong. Rock does not have a hull. Rock does not have symmetry. Rock does not have an internal structure that reads like layered plating, over and over, sheet after sheet, as if someone built a wall 3 times thicker than it needed to be and then decided to add another wall behind it for good measure. I sat up straight and called for a full active scan. Commander Threll Vantos does not like to be interrupted during first shift briefing, but some things cannot wait. I sent the flag directly to his console, the kind of flag we are trained never to send unless we are certain. He looked at me through the glass partition separating sensor bay from the command chair, annoyed, then looked at his own screen and stopped being annoyed. The room went quiet, in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes at the same moment that something has changed. The active scan results filled 3 panels before I could even finish reading the first one. Hull density measurements that did not match any registry we carried. A power core signature that pulsed low and steady, like something sleeping rather than something running. Armor plating layered in patterns that made no sense for a ship that small. Patterns you would expect on a mobile fortress, not a single vessel barely the size of one of our light corvettes. Threll walked down from his chair, which he almost never does, and stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. "Run it again," he said. I ran it again. The numbers did not change. If anything, the second sweep gave us a clearer picture, and the clearer picture was worse. Whatever this ship was, its defensive shell alone could likely absorb a full volley from 3 of our escort cruisers and keep drifting like nothing had happened. "Identify the design," Threll said. I searched every database we carry, the Coalition Registry, the Trade Guild Archive, even the old conflict records from wars fought before either of us was born. Nothing matched. Not the hull shape, not the plating pattern, not the drive configuration folded quietly at the rear of the vessel like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "Unknown," I said, because that was the only honest answer. Threll straightened. I have flown with him long enough to know his moods, and this was not caution, this was something closer to excitement, the kind of excitement a hunter gets when a much bigger animal wanders into a clearing than the one they were originally tracking. "Wake the fleet," he said. "All escort vessels to stand by. I want eyes on that thing from every angle we have." Word spread through the Aventine in minutes. By the time our escort ships fell into loose formation around the unknown vessel, keeping a respectful distance of several thousand units, half the crew had found some excuse to walk past the sensor bay and glance at the readings for themselves. I understood the curiosity, I felt it too, but underneath the curiosity, something colder was settling into my chest, and I think everyone on that deck felt it at the same time I did. The ship was not responding. We tried standard hailing frequencies first, the ones recognized across most of known space, simple pulses that essentially mean, "We see you, please identify yourself." Nothing came back. We tried again on a wider band. Still nothing. Threll ordered a visual sweep with our best long-range imaging array, and the picture that resolved on the main screen made the bridge fall silent again. The hull was dark, matte, almost featureless, except for a scattering of small lights along one side that might have been running lamps or might have been sensor ports. We could not tell which. There were no visible weapon emplacements, which should have been reassuring and somehow was not, because a ship built like a fortress does not need visible weapons to be dangerous. There was a symbol near the front section, simple, geometric, unlike any trademark or military insignia in our records. "Could be derelict after all," said Rennick, our tactical officer, though he did not sound like he believed it. "Derelict ships do not maintain a stable power core reading for 6 hours straight," I said. "Whatever is in there is alive, or something is keeping it that way." Threll ordered a probe, a small unmanned scout drone, harmless, unarmed, designed only to get closer and gather better data than we could from a distance. We watched it cross the gap between our formation and the unknown vessel, a slow crawl across empty space that felt like it took far longer than it should have. The drone reached within 500 units of the hull. Then the ship moved. Not much. A slight shift, a subtle realignment, the kind of motion a sleeping animal makes when it senses something nearby without fully waking. But the sensor board lit up with new data the moment it happened, because that small motion revealed something we had not seen before. The drive section at the rear was not idle at all. It had been running the entire time, quietly, so efficiently that our first scans had barely registered the output. Now that it stirred, even slightly, the numbers climbed high enough that 3 separate warning systems on my console triggered at once. "Pull the drone back," Threll ordered. Too late. The ship's small motion had already ended, settling back into its previous position as if nothing had happened at all. The drone, still transmitting, drifted past the hull and continued on its programmed path, apparently unnoticed or simply ignored. Ignored. That word sat uncomfortably in my mind. A ship with that kind of armor, that kind of power reserve, choosing not to react to a probe passing within touching distance, not because it could not, but because it did not consider the probe worth reacting to. I have flown alongside predators before, in the sense that our coalition includes several species with instincts sharper and older than mine. I recognized the feeling that crept over the bridge in that moment, because I had seen it before in the eyes of officers from those predator species when something larger than themselves crossed their path. It is the feeling of being reminded, quietly and without any real threat spoken aloud, that you are not automatically at the top of whatever order exists out here. "Ambassador Naiva Sol has been notified," came a voice over the comm, our communications officer relaying word from Fleet Command. "She requests a full briefing before any further action is taken." Threll's jaw tightened. I understood his frustration. Diplomats move slowly, and slow decisions in the presence of an unknown armed vessel felt, to a tactical mind like his, like exactly the wrong kind of slow. But orders were orders, and even a commander eager to act does not ignore a direct instruction from coalition leadership. "Maintain formation," he said. "Nobody fires. Nobody approaches without my order. Sayla, I want continuous readings, and I want to know the moment anything changes." Understood. For the next several hours, I did exactly that. I watched the unknown vessel, the way you watch a sleeping predator when you are not sure whether it is actually asleep, or simply waiting for you to relax your guard. The power signature stayed steady, no further movement, no response to any of our repeated hailing attempts. I began cross-referencing the little information we did have, hoping some pattern would emerge that our first searches had missed. The hull material, once I isolated its signature more precisely, showed traces of an alloy composition that matched nothing in our trade records, nothing in our conflict archives, nothing even in the oldest fragments of pre-coalition history stored in the deep archive banks. Whatever built this ship had done so using methods entirely outside anything we understood. And then I found the one detail that made the back of my neck go cold. Buried in the layered plating readings was a redundancy pattern, a repeated structural reinforcement that appeared not once, Not twice, but 7 separate times across different sections of the hull. 7 layers of backup protection, each one seemingly capable of holding the ship together, even if every other layer failed completely. I had never seen a design philosophy like it. Every ship I had ever studied balanced protection against weight, against speed, against cost. This ship seemed to have been built by someone who assumed every single system would eventually be damaged, and planned for total failure as the normal expectation, rather than the rare exception. That is not the design of a proud vessel meant to look impressive. That is the design of a species that has learned, through hard experience, never to assume anything will survive intact. I brought the finding to Threll immediately. He studied it in silence for a long moment, and for the first time since the alert first sounded, I saw something on his face that looked less like excitement and more like genuine concern. "Send it to Naiva," he said quietly, "and keep the fleet on alert. Whatever built that ship out there did not build it to look strong. They built it because they expected to need every single layer eventually." Outside the viewport, the small, dark vessel continued to drift in silence, patient, unmoving, utterly indifferent to the growing fleet gathering cautiously around it. I did not know it then, but that quiet, patient stillness would turn out to be the least alarming thing about it. Somewhere inside that hull, someone was watching us right back, and unlike us, they did not seem worried at all. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 hours ago I was asleep in a chair that was never designed for sleeping, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you fly solo missions for a living. I woke up because my proximity sensor chimed, a soft, polite sound that meant something had entered detection range, not the harsh alarm that means something is about to hit me. I sat up, wiped the sleep out of my eyes, and looked at the display. A lot of ships. More than a lot. My scanner counted 11 distinct hulls arranged in a loose formation around my position, and none of them belonged to any registry I recognized offhand, though the general shape and layout suggested coalition design, the kind of multi-species alliance that controls a fair chunk of this region of space. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because I know how this sounds from the outside. I was not hiding. I was not lurking with hostile intent. I was doing exactly what I had been doing for the past 9 days, which is running a long-range survey mission along the edge of contested territory, mapping gravitational anomalies for the navigation charts back home, and generally being about as threatening as a weather balloon. My ship, the Meridian, is a scout-class vessel. Back home, we do not even count it among our combat fleet. It is built for long solo missions, for endurance, for surviving whatever the deep black decides to throw at a single crew member, with no backup for weeks at a time. It carries some defensive systems, because nobody in their right mind sends a ship into unmapped space with nothing at all, but calling it a warship would make every actual warship captain back home laugh out loud. Apparently, to the 11 ships now surrounding me, it looked like something else entirely. I ran my own scan of the formation surrounding me, partly out of professional habit, and partly because waking up boxed in by unfamiliar ships tends to sharpen a person's attention rather quickly. Their vessels were sleek, fast-looking, clearly built for speed and maneuverability rather than raw endurance. Good design, honestly, the kind of thing our own engineers would probably admire under different circumstances. But their hull readings, at least the parts I could measure from this distance, suggested plating far thinner than what I was used to. That difference did not strike me as unusual at the time. Different species build differently. We happen to build heavy, because our species spent most of its history fighting itself before it ever left its home world, and old habits, especially the kind that keep you alive, do not disappear just because you finally reach the stars. Every scout ship we send out gets built like it might need to survive an actual war, even on a routine mapping mission, because somewhere in our collective memory is the lesson that assuming safety gets people killed. I did not think any of that mattered much in this moment. I just wanted to know why 11 ships had quietly surrounded my scout vessel while I was catching a nap. I checked my communications log. Sure enough, there were hailing attempts, several of them, all sent on standard frequencies while I was asleep. My comm system should have woken me for that. I checked the settings and found the problem immediately. An embarrassing one. My automated response system had been set to silent mode after I disabled it 2 days earlier to deal with a stretch of ambient interference near a pulsar field, and I had simply forgotten to turn it back on. That explained a lot. From the outside, a ship that goes quiet after multiple hailing attempts probably looks a great deal more mysterious and possibly more threatening than a tired pilot who forgot to flip a switch. I fixed the setting immediately and sent a standard identification pulse, the kind every properly registered vessel is supposed to broadcast, containing basic information, no threat, survey mission, requesting safe passage. Simple, polite, exactly the sort of thing you send when you realize you have unintentionally alarmed a formation of strangers. I watched the formation for a reaction. For a long moment, nothing happened, which honestly made me more nervous than if something had. 11 ships sitting perfectly still, watching me, saying nothing, is not a comforting sight no matter how calm you try to stay. Then one of their ships edged slightly closer, a small drone by the look of it, unarmed as far as I could tell, clearly there just to gather a better look. I let it approach, no reason to treat a harmless probe as a threat, and honestly, I understood the impulse. If I had found an unidentified vessel drifting quiet in contested space, I probably would have sent a probe too. The drone passed close, gathered whatever data it needed, and continued on. I noted with some interest that my ship's automatic point defense system had briefly registered the drone as a low-priority object and then, correctly, ignored it entirely, since it posed no danger. That is standard behavior. My ship does that constantly during survey missions, tracking debris, ignoring anything that does not represent an actual threat. I did not think twice about it. I would later learn that this small, unremarkable moment had apparently unsettled the entire formation watching me. From where I sat, it barely registered as an event at all. I spent the next stretch of time doing what any reasonable person would do in my position, which is trying to figure out exactly who these ships belonged to and whether I had wandered somewhere I was not supposed to be. My charts for this sector were incomplete, which was, after all, the entire reason I had been sent out here in the first place, to fill in the blanks. It was entirely possible I had drifted closer to contested coalition territory than intended. I ran a check against every open registry my ship's database carried. The hull designs matched a partial entry linked to a large multi-species alliance operating along this stretch of the frontier, a group we had crossed paths with only rarely, mostly through distant trade contacts and the occasional formal exchange of survey data. Nothing hostile in the history between us, as far as I knew, but also nothing especially close. We were, essentially, distant neighbors who had exchanged a few polite greetings and otherwise kept to ourselves. That made the 11-ship formation a lot more understandable, and honestly, a lot less alarming. A patrol group encountering an unidentified vessel near contested space would naturally investigate. I would have done the same thing in their position. The mistake, if there had been one, was mine, for drifting quiet and unresponsive into their patrol zone while asleep. I composed a longer message, still using standard diplomatic language, explaining my mission, apologizing for the earlier silence, and requesting guidance on how they would like to proceed. I kept it simple, polite, and direct, because in my experience, complicated explanations tend to create more suspicion than they resolve, especially with an unfamiliar audience. I sent it, and settled back to wait. While waiting, I ran a full diagnostic on the Meridian, partly out of habit, and partly because it never hurts to know exactly what condition your ship is in before you find out how a tense situation is going to unfold. Everything red-green, power core stable, running at a modest fraction of its total output, since cruising quietly through survey space does not exactly demand much energy. Armor integrity at full strength, untested, since nothing on this trip had come close to challenging it. Weapon systems, such as they were, sitting completely dormant, exactly as they had been for the entire 9-day mission. I want to say again, because I think it matters, that I was not carrying anything unusual for a scout ship of my class. Standard defensive plating, layered the way every long-range vessel from home gets layered, because our engineers do not believe in single points of failure. Standard point defense systems, enough to handle debris fields and the occasional automated hazard, nothing built for actual combat against a comparable warship. A drive system tuned for efficiency and endurance rather than raw speed, because when you are alone in deep space for weeks at a time, running out of power is a far greater danger than running into trouble. To me, none of it felt remarkable. It was simply how ships from home were built, a design philosophy so old and so deeply ingrained that most of us never gave it a second thought. We built for survival first, performance second, because that priority order had been carved into every generation of engineers going back to our earliest ventures into space, and further back than that, into the long history that came before. I had no way of knowing, sitting quietly in my cockpit waiting for a response from 11 unfamiliar ships, that the very ordinariness of my vessel was precisely what had put their entire formation on edge. An answer finally came through, brief and formal, informing me that a representative would be in contact shortly and instructing me to hold my current position without further movement. I acknowledged the message and settled in to wait, unaware that somewhere aboard one of those distant ships, a sensor officer was staring at readings from my ordinary scout vessel with an expression of quiet, growing concern. I brewed a cup of coffee, because there is very little in this universe that a decent cup of coffee cannot make marginally more bearable, and settled back into my chair to wait out whatever came next. The stars outside my viewport looked exactly the same as they had an hour earlier, calm, distant, indifferent to whatever small drama was unfolding in this particular pocket of space. I had survived worse waiting games than this one. I figured this would resolve itself the same way most misunderstandings out here eventually did, with a bit of patience, a few formal exchanges, and probably an awkward apology from someone on one side or the other. While I waited, my mind drifted back to the training I had received before ever being cleared for a solo survey mission. Every pilot from home spends months learning protocols for first encounters, because our history is full of stories, some ancient and some more recent, about how quickly a misunderstanding between strangers can spiral into something nobody wanted. The lesson drilled into every one of us was simple: slow down, announce yourself clearly. Never assume the other side understands your intentions just because they seem obvious to you. What looks like caution from one side can look like a threat from the other, and what looks like an ordinary vessel to its own crew can look like something else entirely to eyes that have never seen its kind before. I thought about that lesson now, turning it over while the coffee cooled beside me. I had grown so used to the Meridian, to its layered plating and its steady, unremarkable hum, that I rarely stopped to consider how it might appear to someone encountering a ship like it for the very first time. To me, it was simply home, a familiar shape I had lived inside for years, dented in places, patched in others, comfortable in the way only a long-traveled vessel can be. I had never once looked at its hull and thought the word alarming. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts, signaling an incoming transmission. I straightened in my chair, set the coffee aside, and opened the channel. The voice that came through was formal, careful, translated through my ship's onboard system with only a slight delay, the kind of small pause that told me the words on the other end were not originally spoken in my own language. It introduced itself as belonging to a coalition diplomatic office, requesting confirmation of my origin, my mission, and my intentions in this sector. I answered honestly, because I had nothing to hide and no reason to complicate a situation that already felt tense enough. I explained the survey mission, the incomplete charts, the 9 days of solo travel, and the honest mistake of drifting quiet while my automated systems sat disabled. I kept my tone even, respectful, the way I would want to be addressed if our positions were reversed. There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. When the voice returned, it asked a question that struck me as unusual at the time, though I understood its purpose much better later. It asked whether my vessel represented the standard configuration for ships of my kind, or whether it had been specially outfitted for this particular mission. I told the truth, because there was no reason not to. Standard configuration, I said. Nothing special added for this trip. Just an ordinary scout ship, built the way every scout ship from home gets built. Another pause followed that answer, and something about the quality of the silence on the other end made me wonder, for the first time, whether my honest answer had somehow made things more complicated rather than less. The voice thanked me for my cooperation and informed me that a senior representative would make contact soon to discuss the situation further. The channel closed, and I was left alone again with my cooling coffee and the quiet hum of the meridian around me. I sat there for a while, running the conversation back through my mind, trying to work out what exactly had prompted that particular question. It was a reasonable thing to ask, I supposed, if a patrol group had genuinely never encountered a ship built the way ours were built. I filed the thought away, unwilling to spend too much energy guessing at intentions I could not confirm, and turned my attention instead to keeping the meridian steady and ready for whatever came next. Outside, the formation of 11 ships continued to hold its position around me, patient, watchful, close enough that I could track each individual vessel on my display without difficulty. I found myself studying their shapes the same way I imagined they had studied mine, noting the sleek lines, the visible speed of their design, the confidence in the way they moved, even while holding still. Different builders, different priorities, different lessons learned from different histories. None of that struck me as cause for alarm. It struck me, if anything, as simply interesting, the kind of small discovery that made long survey missions worth the loneliness that came with them. Ambassador Naiva Sol arrived on the Aventine faster than I expected, her shuttle docking within the hour, and the moment she stepped onto the bridge, the entire tone of the room shifted from cautious curiosity to something far more serious. I am Sela Kor, still watching the same quiet, unmoving vessel that had not left our sensors since the first alert sounded hours earlier. By now, my board was filled with data, more than I had ever gathered on a single unidentified contact in my entire career, and none of it made the situation feel any less strange. Naiva did not waste time on greetings. She walked directly to the sensor bay, studied my readings in silence for a long moment, and then turned to Commander Threll with an expression I had rarely seen on a diplomat, something closer to genuine worry than practiced calm. "You are certain about the redundancy pattern," she said. It was not really a question. "Confirm twice," I answered before Threll could. 7 independent reinforcement layers across the hull. I have never recorded anything close to that ratio on any vessel in our registry, including our own flagships. Naiva nodded slowly, then reached into the small case she carried and produced a data slate, offering it to Threll. He took it, scanned the contents, and his expression darkened. "What is this?" he asked. "Old fragments," Naiva said, "pulled from the deep archive this morning, once I saw the preliminary report. Records from 3 separate border conflicts over the past 2 centuries, each one involving contact with a species matching this general profile. Distant contact only, never direct engagement with any of our own forces, but enough second-hand accounts from other alliances to build a partial picture." "And the picture says what exactly?" Threll asked. "That whoever built that ship out there comes from a species that does not start conflicts," Naiva said, "but has never lost one it did not choose to end on its own terms." The bridge went quiet. I had heard rumors before, the kind that circulate through any long-serving crew, stories about a distant species referred to in old trade circles as the Quiet Ones, known less for aggression and more for an unsettling calm that apparently unnerved everyone who dealt with them during moments of tension. I had always assumed the stories were exaggerated, the kind of thing that grows taller with every retelling. Standing on that bridge, staring at the 7-layer hull reading still glowing on my display, I was no longer sure the stories had been exaggerated at all. "We are not going to provoke anything," Naiva said firmly, addressing the whole bridge now, rather than just Threll. "Maintain formation. No weapons charge. I want a formal contact attempt, through proper diplomatic channels, and I want it handled personally." Threll's jaw tightened again. That same expression I had seen earlier, when orders forced him to hold back from an instinct he clearly did not agree with. But he gave the order, and the bridge crew moved to comply. I stayed at my station, watching the unknown ship, and noticed something new the moment Naiva's formal hailing signal went out. The vessel responded almost immediately this time, far faster than it had to our earlier attempts, as though something on their end had simply been reset or reactivated rather than genuinely absent before. The message that came back was short, formatted in a translation protocol our systems handled with surprising ease, as if whoever sent it had specifically built the transmission to be understood by unfamiliar systems without friction. I read it aloud for the bridge. "This vessel is registered survey craft Meridian, operating under peaceful mapping authorization. Apologies for earlier lack of response, resulting from a communications oversight. No hostile intent. Requesting confirmation of safe passage through this sector to continue mission." Simple, polite, almost disarmingly ordinary. And yet the moment those words appeared on the main screen, I watched several officers around the bridge exchange uneasy glances, because ordinary was exactly what none of us had expected. "A survey craft," Rennick said slowly, testing the words like they tasted strange in his mouth. "That thing out there, with 7 layers of reinforced armor and a power core that could probably outlast 3 of our cruisers combined, is calling itself a survey craft." "It might be telling the truth," I offered, though even as I said it, the words felt uncertain in my own mouth. "That is what concerns me," Naiva said quietly, and the whole bridge turned to look at her. "If this is what they consider an ordinary mapping vessel, unremarkable enough to send out with a single pilot on a routine mission, then I do not want to imagine what they consider a serious warship." Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Threll finally broke the silence. "Orders, Ambassador." Naiva studied the message again before answering. "Grant the passage request. Formally through proper channels, with an escort formation to confirm the boundary of our patrol zone. No hostile posture. I want this handled exactly the way we would handle any other polite request from any other neighboring vessel." "And if it is not what it claims to be," Threll pressed, "then we will have shown restraint and professionalism, which costs us nothing," Naiva answered. "And if it is exactly what it claims to be, an ordinary survey ship piloted by one individual doing their job, then we will have avoided creating an incident with a species whose full capabilities we clearly do not understand." I could see the argument settling uneasily over the bridge, agreement mixed with obvious frustration from the more tactically minded officers, including Threll himself. But orders were orders, and preparations began for a formal escort to guide the Meridian safely through the edge of our patrol zone. It should have ended there. Looking back, I believe it very nearly did. While the escort formation assembled, I found myself pulled aside by Naiva, who asked to review the archive fragments with me personally rather than leave the matter to a junior officer. I followed her to a small briefing room off the main corridor, still unsettled by everything I had witnessed on the bridge, and grateful for a few quiet minutes to gather my thoughts. "You handled yourself well today," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Most sensor officers freeze the first time their instruments contradict a superior's assumptions." "I only reported what the readings showed," I said. "That is exactly the point," she answered. "Readings do not lie, but people often prefer their fears over their instruments. Remember that. If you continue in this line of work, it will matter again, probably sooner than you expect." She opened the data slate and walked me through the archive fragments in more detail than Threll had seen on the bridge. The stories were fragmentary, second-hand, pieced together from trade partners and distant allies who had crossed paths with this species during old border disputes long before either of us had been born. None of the fragments described outright aggression. Each one, without exception, described the same pattern. A conflict would begin through someone else's impatience or misunderstanding, escalate briefly, and then end abruptly, usually with the other side suffering losses far beyond what they expected, while the species in question suffered comparatively little and rarely pursued the matter further than necessary to end the threat. "They do not seem to want territory," Naiva said, tapping through the fragments. "They do not seem to want tribute or apology either. They simply want to be left alone, and they respond to provocation with exactly enough force to guarantee that outcome, and not one measure more." "That should be reassuring," I said. "It would be, if every commander in this fleet understood restraint the way that pattern suggests they do," Naiva replied. "Unfortunately, restraint is rarely the first instinct of someone who feels cornered, and right now, half our escort formation feels exactly that way, whether they admit it or not." I thought about Threll's earlier expression, the barely restrained frustration when Naiva overruled his instinct to escalate, and understood exactly what she meant. We returned to the bridge as the escort formation finished assembling around the edge of our patrol boundary, ships arranging themselves into the agreed pattern meant to guide the meridian safely through without any appearance of hostility. I resumed my station, watching the readings from the unknown vessel, still steady, still calm, apparently unaware or unconcerned by the quiet tension rippling through our formation. A brief acknowledgement came through from the meridian, confirming receipt of the passage grant and expressing what our translation system rendered as gratitude, simple and direct, without embellishment. I found myself oddly reassured by the plainness of it. Whatever this pilot was, they did not seem interested in games or hidden meanings. They asked for passage, we granted it, and they said thank you. It felt, for a brief moment, like the kind of straightforward exchange that happens 100 times a day along any ordinary trade route. I allowed myself, for the first time since the alert first sounded, to relax slightly in my chair. That relief lasted less than half an hour. The trouble began roughly 40 minutes later, not from the unknown vessel at all, but from one of our own escort ships, a fast attack corvette named the Iron Veil, commanded by an officer named Dax Orlan, whose reputation for impatience had apparently followed him even into this delicate situation. I picked up the disturbance first, through a change in the Iron Veil's power readings, a spike far beyond what a routine escort maneuver should require. I flagged it immediately, but before Threll could respond to my warning, a priority channel opened across the fleet, Orlan's voice cutting through, tense and clipped. "That thing just powered up its drive core beyond baseline. I am reading a significant energy surge from the target vessel." My own board showed nothing of the kind. I checked again immediately, cross-referencing every sensor angle available to me. The Meridian's power signature had not changed at all since the earlier readings. Still steady, still calm, still sitting well below what its systems appeared capable of producing. "Negative," I said quickly, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. "I am reading no change in the target's power output. Repeat, no change detected." But Orlan's voice had already moved past my correction, talking over the channel with rising urgency, convinced of a threat that my instruments insisted was not there. I understood, in that moment, exactly how a misunderstanding this size could spiral out of anyone's control, because fear does not always wait for confirmation before it acts. "Orlan, stand down," Threll ordered sharply. "Sensor officer confirms no change in target output. Hold position." There was a pause on the channel, static crackling faintly, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope the situation might settle back into calm. Then Orlan spoke again, quieter this time, but no less certain. "I am not willing to bet my crew's safety on a sensor reading, Commander, requesting permission to fire a warning shot across the target's bow." "Denied," Threll snapped. "Stand down immediately." I watched the Iron Veil's readings on my board, watched the weapon systems flicker from standby toward active, and felt my stomach tighten with a dread I had never experienced in 6 cycles of service. Whatever happened in the next few seconds was about to happen far faster than any of us on the Aventine's bridge could control from this distance. Orlan Naiva's voice cut in, sharp and commanding despite her diplomatic role. "If you fire on that vessel without cause, you will be responsible for whatever follows, and I promise you, this coalition will not thank you for it." The channel went silent. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened, and I allowed myself to believe the warning had landed, that reason had won out over fear. Then my board lit up with a new reading, one I recognized instantly and dreaded seeing. Weapon discharge, originating from the Iron Veil, trajectory aimed directly across the bow of the vessel known as the Meridian. The warning shot had been fired, and somewhere out there, alone in a ship that was, by his own account, nothing more than an ordinary survey craft, a single pilot who had trusted our formal offer of safe passage was about to discover exactly how quickly good intentions could collapse into exactly the kind of incident nobody on our side had wanted to create. I switched my focus entirely to the Meridian's readings, watching for any reaction, any change, any sign of what might come next. For a moment, nothing happened at all, the vessel simply absorbing the near miss with the same eerie calm it had shown since the very beginning. Then the numbers on my display began to shift, and this time there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The Meridian's power core was climbing, not toward anything resembling the runaway surge Orlan had falsely reported earlier, but toward something deliberate, controlled, and precise, the unmistakable signature of a system preparing to respond. Whatever restraint that quiet ship had shown for the past several hours, I understood in that instant that it was about to end. Aboard the Meridian, the moment felt entirely different, though no less serious. I am Ethan Cole again, and I want to describe exactly what that warning shot felt like from inside my own cockpit, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. One instant I was reviewing the confirmed passage route, relieved that the earlier tension seemed to have resolved itself through proper channels. The next instant, a proximity alert screamed across my console, followed immediately by an impact warning as something crossed close enough to my hull to register as a near miss rather than a direct hit. My training took over before my thoughts could fully catch up. I ran a rapid check on hull integrity, found no damage, and immediately widened my sensor sweep to identify the source. It did not take long. One of the escort vessels, the smaller fast-moving one that had been holding position slightly apart from the rest of the formation, showed a weapon discharge signature that matched the timing of the near miss exactly. I sat very still for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle rather than acting on it immediately, because I have learned over the years that the worst decisions in tense situations come from the first 3 seconds after a shock, not the 4th or 5th. I checked my own systems again. No damage, no further incoming fire. The rest of the formation had not moved, had not powered any additional weapons that I could detect, which told me this was very likely the action of a single ship acting alone rather than a coordinated attack from the entire escort group. That distinction mattered enormously to how I chose to respond. Back home, we are taught from the earliest stages of flight training that a single actor's mistake should never be answered with a response aimed at an entire group who did not participate in that mistake. It sounds like a simple lesson, almost obvious when stated plainly, but I have flown with people who forgot it in the heat of the moment, and I have seen how quickly forgetting it turns a survivable misunderstanding into something far worse for everyone involved. I opened a channel, not to the entire formation, but specifically toward the ship that had fired, hoping my systems could isolate the correct frequency from the data I had gathered. My voice, when I finally spoke, came out steadier than I expected, given how fast my heart was still beating. "This is the Meridian. I have registered a weapon discharge from your position. I am undamaged, and I am not returning fire. I would like to understand why that shot was taken before this goes any further." No answer came back immediately, and I did not expect one to. I understood, even without knowing the internal politics of the formation surrounding me, that whoever fired that shot was very likely dealing with a chain of command reacting in real time, exactly the kind of chaotic moment where a lone pilot's calm request for explanation might take a little while to reach the right ears. I kept the Meridian steady, weapons still dormant, drive output rising only slightly, just enough to keep full maneuvering capability ready in case a second, more serious shot followed the first. I did not want to escalate. I also did not want to be caught unprepared if escalation came anyway, because hoping for the best while planning only for the best is, in my experience, one of the fastest ways to get yourself killed out here. The seconds stretched on, silent and tense, and I found myself thinking, oddly, about every lesson I had ever been taught about first encounters, about patience, about the difference between strength held in reserve and strength used carelessly. I had followed every one of those lessons since waking up, surrounded by this formation, and for a moment, sitting there with my hull still humming faintly from a shot that had missed me by a narrower margin than I liked to think about, I wondered whether patience alone was going to be enough to see this through. I did not reach for my weapons. Not yet, but I made certain, quietly and without announcement, that they were ready the instant I decided they needed to be. The second shot never came, but something worse did. I am Sayla Kor, and I watched it happen from my sensor station with a growing sense that events had slipped entirely beyond anyone's control. Orlan, apparently convinced his first warning shot had been justified and desperate to prove it, ordered a second firing sequence, this time not a warning across the bow, but a direct targeting lock on the Meridian's forward section. Orlan, stand down. That is a direct order, Threll shouted across the command channel, and for the first time since I had known him, I heard something close to alarm in his voice, rather than his usual controlled authority. Orlan did not stand down, whether from panic, stubborn pride, or simple conviction that he was protecting his crew from a threat the rest of us could not see. He fired. I watched the discharge leave the Iron Veil's forward battery, watched the trajectory arc directly toward the Meridian's hull, and felt my stomach drop with the certainty that whatever calm restraint that quiet vessel had shown for the past several hours was about to end in a way none of us could take back. It never reached its target. I do not fully understand, even now, exactly what happened in the fraction of a second before impact, but my sensors recorded something that defense analysts would spend weeks afterward trying to fully explain. A narrow, precisely focused energy pulse erupted from the Meridian's forward section, not aimed at the Iron Veil's hull, not aimed at its crew compartment, but targeted with impossible precision directly at the incoming projectile itself, intercepting and neutralizing it well before it ever reached its intended target. The bridge fell into stunned silence. "Report," Threll said, his voice tight. "The incoming shot was intercepted," I said, still reading the numbers as they scrolled across my display, hardly believing them myself. Target vessel used a defensive countermeasure to destroy the projectile mid-flight. No damage to the Iron Veil, no further offensive action detected from the target. "They could have hit Orlan's ship directly," Rennick said quietly, disbelief written across his face. "They had a clean shot. They chose to destroy the projectile instead." I understood the weight of what he was saying even as he said it. A vessel with weapon systems precise enough to intercept a small, fast-moving projectile mid-flight could almost certainly have destroyed the entire Iron Veil with far less effort. Instead, whoever piloted that ship had chosen the narrowest possible response, removing the threat without harming a single member of the crew who had created it. That restraint, more than anything else that had happened so far, was what finally silenced every voice of doubt still lingering on our bridge. Orlan's channel crackled open again, his voice noticeably shaken. "I am reading a system fault. My weapon array just went dark. I have no offensive capability." I checked my own readings and confirmed it immediately. The Iron Veil's entire weapon system had gone completely dormant, not damaged, not destroyed, simply and precisely disabled, as though something had reached across the gap between the two ships and quietly switched off exactly the systems responsible for the aggression, and nothing else. Life support remained untouched, engines remained fully functional, even the ship's defensive shielding remained active and undamaged. Only the weapons had been affected, disabled with a precision that felt less like an attack and more like a pointed, deliberate message. "They disarmed him," Naiva said quietly, almost to herself. "Without firing a single shot meant to harm anyone, they simply removed his ability to cause further harm." A new transmission arrived a moment later, addressed to the entire formation this time, rather than a single ship. I read it aloud, my voice steadier than I expected given how tightly my chest had clenched only moments earlier. This is the Meridian. One vessel in your formation fired directly at my hull, following an earlier warning shot. I have neutralized the projectile and temporarily disabled that vessel's weapon systems to prevent further escalation. No injuries have been caused on my end. I have no intention of causing any on yours, provided no further hostile action is taken. I remain willing to complete this passage peacefully. The bridge stayed silent for a long moment after the message finished playing. That was restraint, Threll finally said, quietly, almost to himself. That was a demonstration of exactly how much force they were willing to use, and exactly how much more they chose not to. Naiva nodded slowly. A single pilot, alone, in what they themselves describe as an ordinary survey vessel, just disarmed one of our attack corvettes without firing a single shot meant to cause harm, intercepted an incoming attack with what looked like effortless precision, and then apologized for the inconvenience in the same message. I do not think any of us fully understood, until this exact moment, what we were actually dealing with. I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, about the 7-layer hull reinforcement I had discovered hours earlier, the design philosophy of a species that builds for total system failure as an expectation rather than an exception. I understood now, watching the aftermath of Orlan's failed attack unfold across my sensor board, that the same philosophy clearly extended beyond simple armor plating. This was a species that built weapons, and pilots, capable of overwhelming force, and then trained those same pilots to use only the smallest fraction of that force necessary to end a threat, nothing more. That combination, I realized capability, paired with deliberate restraint, was far more unsettling than raw aggression could ever have been. Aggression is at least predictable. Restraint held in reserve by someone who could clearly choose otherwise leaves you wondering, every single moment, exactly how close to the edge you have already come without realizing it. Threll gave the order to formally stand down the entire escort formation, weapons fully disengaged, drive systems reduced to standard patrol output, every ship instructed to hold position without any further aggressive posturing. Orlan's voice came through once more, quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty, offering something close to an apology, directed at the open channel, rather than any specific person. "I thought I was protecting my crew," he said. "I was wrong to act without confirmation." Nobody responded immediately. I do not think anyone quite knew what to say. I switched my focus back to the Meridian's readings, watching as its weapon systems, which had briefly and precisely engaged during the interception, powered back down to the same quiet, dormant state they had maintained since our very first scan hours earlier. Whatever capability that ship carried, it had used exactly what the moment required, and not a fraction more, before settling right back into stillness. Aboard the Meridian, I imagine the moment felt very different. I am Ethan Cole once more, and I want to be honest about something. The decision to intercept that second shot rather than simply absorb it or retaliate directly against the ship that fired it was not some grand display of principle worked out in careful deliberation. It happened in less than a second, guided by training so deeply ingrained that it operated faster than conscious thought ever could. Every pilot from home learns the same core lesson early in their career, repeated so often it becomes instinct rather than memory. Match the threat, not the anger. A single ship acting alone, even if that ship fires directly at you, does not represent the intentions of an entire formation, and responding as though it does risks turning one person's mistake into a conflict that could cost far more than it needed to. I had a fraction of a second to choose between destroying the incoming projectile or destroying the ship that launched it, and the choice, honestly, did not feel difficult at all. It felt like exactly what I had been trained to do since the earliest days of flight school, back when instructors drilled the same lesson into every cadet until it became as automatic as breathing. Disabling the Iron Veil's weapon systems afterward followed the same logic. I had no desire to harm anyone aboard that ship, including the pilot whose fear or misjudgment had caused the entire incident. I simply wanted to ensure no second shot could follow the first, and my systems were more than capable of achieving that outcome without causing a single injury. I sent my message to the formation and settled back into my chair, watching my sensors for any sign of further escalation. None came. The formation's weapon systems powered down across the board, drive outputs settling into standard patrol readings, every ship holding steady without any additional aggressive posturing. I allowed myself, finally, to breathe out slowly, releasing tension I had not fully realized I was holding until that exact moment. It was not over. I understood that much clearly enough. A misunderstanding this size does not simply resolve itself the instant the shooting stops. But the immediate danger, at least, had passed, and for the first time since waking up, surrounded by 11 unfamiliar ships, I allowed myself a small measure of relief. Back aboard the Aventine, the mood on the bridge had shifted into something quieter and more thoughtful than the tension that had gripped it only minutes earlier. I am Selakor again, and I remember Threll standing near my station for a long while after the immediate danger passed, staring at the now dormant readings from the meridian, as though trying to memorize every detail of them. Naiva joined him eventually, the two of them speaking in low voices that I could only partly overhear. "We nearly started something today that we would not have been able to finish," Threll said. "Not against that ship, and not against whatever stands behind it. That is precisely why the Coalition maintains standing protocols for first contact," Naiva replied. "Not because we expect every stranger to be dangerous, but because we cannot always know in advance which ones are, and the cost of guessing wrong is rarely paid by the one who guessed." Threll was quiet for a moment. Orlan believed he was protecting his crew. "I believe that too," Naiva said. "Fear makes people act before they think, and Orlan is not the first officer in this fleet's history to mistake a defensive instinct for a tactical certainty. But belief does not undo consequence. He will need to answer for what happened today, through proper review, not through anyone's private judgment on this bridge." I found myself agreeing with her, though I said nothing. It was easy, from where I sat, to imagine myself in Orlan's position, staring at readings that felt threatening even when the actual numbers said otherwise, and I could not honestly claim I would have handled that fear any better than he had. The difference, I realized, was that my instruments had told me the truth, and I had trusted them, while his fear had spoken louder than his own sensor board. Rennick, still visibly shaken, spoke up from his station. "What happens now? Do we simply let it continue on its way, as if nothing happened?" "We honor the passage we granted," Naiva said. "We apologize formally for the unauthorized action taken against it, and we make certain the pilot understands that what happened today does not represent how this coalition intends to treat those who approach us peacefully. Beyond that, we watch, we learn, and we make sure every commander in this fleet understands exactly what we witnessed today, so that the next encounter, whenever and wherever it happens, does not begin with the same kind of fear that nearly cost us everything this time." I sent the formal apology myself, translating Naiva's careful wording into the same protocol the Meridian's own systems had used so easily earlier, and watched the acknowledgement arrive only moments later, brief and gracious, without any trace of resentment or demand for further concession. It was, once again, exactly the kind of simple, direct response I had come to associate with this unfamiliar pilot over the past several hours, and it left me with more questions about the species behind it than any of the alarming sensor readings ever had. Aboard the Meridian, I imagine the quiet that followed felt just as strange as it did on our side. Two very different crews, on two very different ships, both trying to settle back into calm after a moment that had nearly gone terribly wrong. I am Ethan Cole again, and once the formal apology arrived from the Coalition ambassador, I found myself surprised by how genuinely relieved I felt reading it. I had expected, if anything, a colder response, perhaps a formal justification for what had happened rather than an outright acknowledgement of fault. Instead, the message was direct, respectful, and honest about the mistake. Exactly the kind of response that made the whole encounter feel less like a near disaster and more like an unfortunate misunderstanding between strangers who simply did not yet know how to read each other clearly. I sent back a brief acknowledgement of my own, keeping it as simple and unresentful as I could manage, because holding on to anger over a mistake that had already been corrected rarely accomplishes anything useful, especially this far from home, with no real way to resolve old grievances face to face. I settled back into my chair, running a full diagnostic on the Meridian once more, confirming that the brief defensive engagement had cost me nothing in terms of systems or power reserves. Everything read exactly as it had before the shot was fired: steady, calm, ready. I allowed myself, finally, a moment of genuine stillness, the first since waking up to find 11 unfamiliar ships surrounding my position. That relief, as it turned out, would not last very long either, because a new transmission arrived only minutes later, this one carrying a signature I did not recognize, originating from far beyond the edge of the current formation, and growing steadily closer with every passing second. The signature grew larger on my display with every passing second, and this time, unlike the confusion of my very first scan hours earlier, there was no mistaking what I was looking at. I am HFY, and I watched 3 additional vessels resolve out of the deep black beyond our formation, their approach steady, unhurried, and entirely unconcealed, as though whoever piloted them felt no need to hide their arrival at all. My board flagged them immediately as sharing hull characteristics with the Meridian, the same layered plating pattern, the same quiet, controlled power signatures, though each of these 3 ships measured significantly larger than the lone survey craft that had first triggered our alert. "Report," Threll said, his voice tight again, the brief calm of the past several minutes evaporating instantly. "3 vessels inbound," I said, reading the numbers as fast as they updated. "Same design family as the target, larger hull mass on all 3. No weapon charge detected. Approach vector suggests a direct course toward the Meridian's position, not toward our formation." "Are they hostile?" Rennick asked, and I could hear the effort it took him to keep his voice steady. "Unknown," I admitted, "but their power output profile matches the pattern we have already observed. Controlled, efficient, nothing that reads as an aggressive posture." Naiva stepped closer to my station, studying the approaching signatures herself. "Open a channel," she said. "Formal, calm, identify our formation and our intentions clearly. I want them to understand exactly what happened here before they draw any conclusions of their own." I sent the transmission immediately, watching the 3 ships continue their steady approach without any change in trajectory or power output, as though the message had been received and simply filed away rather than reacted to with any urgency. That, more than anything, told me something important about who we were dealing with. A formation genuinely intent on confrontation does not approach an armed patrol group without altering its posture in response to a direct hail. These ships continued exactly as they had been, patient, unhurried, entirely unbothered by our presence. A response arrived a few minutes later, and I read it aloud for the bridge, my voice steadier now than it had been during the earlier crisis, though my hand still trembled slightly against my console. "This is escort vessel Holloway, responding to an automated distress ping transmitted several hours ago by survey craft Meridian. We have been advised of the situation through direct contact with our pilot and understand the matter has been resolved without serious harm. We are proceeding to confirm the well-being of our vessel and its pilot, and do not intend any hostile action toward your formation, provided none is offered toward ours." I felt the tension in the room shift again, not vanishing entirely, but settling into something closer to cautious relief than outright alarm. "A distress ping," Threll repeated slowly, "sent hours ago. Before the warning shot was even fired," I confirmed, cross-referencing the timestamp embedded in the transmission against our own records. "This was sent shortly after the Meridian first realized it had been surrounded by our formation, not in response to any hostility, simply a standard precaution, informing their own people of its situation in case something went wrong." Naiva let out a slow breath. They called for help before anything dangerous even happened, purely as a matter of routine caution, and their people are only now arriving, hours later, calm and unhurried, because that is apparently how long it took for a response to reach them from wherever they are actually based. I do not think I want to imagine how much further out their real strength might be stationed, if this is simply the nearest available escort. Threll gave the order to hold formation and stand down fully, weapons remaining disengaged, drive systems maintained at standard patrol output, every ship instructed to allow the 3 approaching vessels a clear, unobstructed path toward the Meridian's position. Nobody on our bridge argued with the order this time. While we waited for the 3 ships to close the remaining distance, Rennick turned to me with a question that had clearly been building in his mind since the moment the distress ping's timestamp came to light. If that message went out hours ago, purely as a precaution, why did it take this long for a response to arrive? He asked. Either their reinforcements are stationed far beyond anything we can currently track, or their communication relay across open space moves at a speed our own systems cannot match. Both possibilities concern me equally, I admitted. If it is distance, then we have no accurate picture of how far their actual territory extends from this border region. If it is communication speed, then every assumption we hold about response times in a genuine crisis needs to be reconsidered entirely. Naiva, still standing nearby, allowed herself a small, tired smile, though there was little humor behind it. Perhaps it is worth remembering that we do not need to solve every mystery about this species in a single afternoon. What matters today is that the situation resolved peacefully, and that we now have direct evidence, rather than old rumors, to guide how we approach any future encounter. Assuming there is a future encounter, Rennick said. There will be, Naiva said simply. Space is large, but not infinite, and borders like this one exist precisely because 2 different territories eventually meet somewhere along the edges. I would rather we meet again, having learned the right lessons from today, than having learned nothing at all. I turned my attention back to my instruments as the conversation settled into a thoughtful quiet, watching the 3 approaching vessels grow steadily larger and more detailed on my display with every passing minute. Even before they reached full scanning range, I could already tell their overall design carried the unmistakable signature of the same builders responsible for the Meridian, the same disciplined restraint in their approach, the same lack of any visible urgency despite carrying, as our sensors would soon confirm, more than enough capability to end our entire patrol formation's presence in this sector without particular difficulty. I watched the 3 ships draw closer, their approach never wavering, never hesitating, until they settled into a loose formation alongside the Meridian, close enough that our sensors could finally get a clear reading on their full specifications. The numbers, when they finally resolved, made the earlier readings from the lone survey craft look almost modest by comparison. Each of the 3 escort vessels carried the same 7-layer reinforced hull structure we had already documented, scaled up considerably in both size and apparent power reserve. Weapon systems, visible now that these ships made no attempt to conceal them, showed configurations far beyond anything in our own registry, precise, layered, clearly designed by engineers who approached every system with the same relentless redundancy philosophy we had already observed in the smaller scout vessel. And yet, for all that raw capability, their posture remained exactly as calm and unthreatening as the Meridians had been from the very beginning. They are not here to fight, I said quietly, mostly to myself, though Threll heard it and nodded slowly beside me. No, he agreed. They are here because one of their own sent a routine message hours ago, and they came to check on him, the same way any of us would check on a crew member who reported trouble. That is all this is. A rescue, not an invasion. I found that thought more unsettling than almost anything else I had learned that day. An entire escort formation, easily capable of overwhelming our patrol group without significant effort, had been dispatched not out of aggression or ambition, but out of simple, ordinary concern for a single pilot's safety. If a lone scout ship's disappearance could summon a response with that much raw capability behind it, purely as routine procedure, I found myself deeply unwilling to imagine what an actual act of aggression against their people might eventually bring in return. A final transmission arrived shortly after, addressed once more to the entire formation, calm and measured in the same straightforward tone we had come to recognize. This is Escort Vessel Holloway. Our pilot confirms the situation has been resolved satisfactorily and requests no further action be taken against the officer responsible for the earlier incident, beyond whatever review your own command structure considers appropriate. We appreciate the safe passage granted and the formal apology issued afterward. We will now escort the Meridian back toward its assigned survey route and continue on our own patrol. We wish your formation continued safe travels. I read the message twice, struck by the final line in particular. A request for leniency toward Orlan, offered freely, without demand or condition, from the very people who had every right to feel wronged by what happened. It was, in its own quiet way, as remarkable as anything else that had unfolded over the course of that long, tense day. Naiva ordered a final formal reply, expressing gratitude for their understanding and wishing the same safe travels in return, and the bridge began, slowly, to unwind from hours of accumulated tension. I stayed at my station long after the 3 escort vessels and the small survey craft had departed our sensor range entirely, reviewing every piece of data I had gathered since the very first alert, trying to make sense of everything I had witnessed. Later that evening, in the privacy of my own quarters, I recorded a personal log entry, something I rarely bothered doing after routine patrols, but this had not felt like a routine patrol at all. I want to record my honest assessment of today's encounter, separate from the official report already filed with command. What alarmed our fleet was never actual aggression. From the very first scan to the very last transmission, the vessel we encountered and the larger formation that eventually arrived to check on it demonstrated nothing but restraint, patience, and a consistent preference for the smallest possible response to every provocation offered against it. What alarmed us was capability, quietly held in reserve, paired with a species that seems entirely unbothered by displaying only a fraction of what it could actually bring to bear. A single scout ship, described by its own pilot as ordinary, unremarkable, ranked below their actual combat vessels back home, was more than sufficient to give our entire patrol formation pause for the better part of a day. I do not know what their real warships look like, and after everything I witnessed today, I find myself in no hurry to find out. I only hope that whatever officers eventually do encounter them under less fortunate circumstances remember what I watched happen here. Restraint offered freely is not weakness. It is simply proof of exactly how much strength is being deliberately withheld. I do not know if I will ever cross paths with that particular pilot again, but I find myself hoping, quietly, that I never have reason to see the full extent of what today's encounter only hinted at. Far across the same stretch of space, aboard the Meridian, the pilot in question was already settling back into the familiar rhythm of a routine survey mission, the events of the day fading quickly into the ordinary background noise of a long solo journey. I am Ethan Cole, closing out this particular chapter of the mission. The escort ships that arrived to check on me stayed only long enough to confirm I was unharmed, exchanged a few words of reassurance, and then peeled off to resume their own patrol route, leaving me alone once more with the quiet hum of the Meridian and the long stretch of unmapped space still waiting ahead of me. I filed my own report before settling in for the evening, keeping it brief and factual, the way most of my reports tend to read, after years of routine missions punctuated by the occasional unexpected complication. Encountered unfamiliar patrol formation. Minor communications delay led to temporary misunderstanding. Situation resolved through standard protocol. No lasting damage. Mission continuing as scheduled. I paused before submitting it, glancing back over the events of the day one more time, the 11 ships, the warning shot, the tense minutes waiting to see whether restraint would win out over fear on either side. It had, in the end, and that felt like the only part of the story truly worth remembering. Everything else, the alarm, the near miss, the arrival of my own people to check on me, already felt like it belonged to a day that had simply run a little longer and a little stranger than most, nothing more. I thought briefly about the censor officer whose voice I had never actually heard, the one whose readings had apparently corrected a panicked commander's false alarm not once but several times throughout the encounter, according to the brief summary the Holloway's crew had shared with me before departing. I did not know her name, and I doubted our paths would ever cross directly, but I found myself grateful all the same. It is a rare thing, in any species, to find someone willing to trust their instruments over their fear, especially when a superior officer is shouting the opposite conclusion directly into their ear. Whatever coalition she served, I suspected they were fortunate to have her. I thought, too, about how differently the entire day might have unfolded if either side had allowed fear to speak louder than patience for even a few moments longer than it already had. A single additional shot, fired a little more accurately, or answered a little less carefully, could have turned an awkward misunderstanding into something neither side would have walked away from unchanged. It was a sobering thought, one I did not dwell on for too long, because dwelling on every possible disaster that did not happen is its own quiet way of losing sleep over nothing. Home felt very far away in moments like this, alone in a scout ship on the edge of unmapped space, but it also felt, in its own strange way, closer than usual. Every lesson that had guided my choices today, patience over panic, precision over anger, restraint held ready rather than spent carelessly, had been taught to me long before I ever left our home system, passed down through generations of pilots who had learned those same lessons the hard way, so that people like me would not have to learn them all over again from nothing. I hoped, quietly, that the coalition officers I had encountered today carried something similar away from the experience, some lesson worth passing on to whoever came after them, so that the next unexpected meeting between our two peoples, whenever it happened, might begin with a little more patience and a little less fear than this one had. I added a single closing line to my official log before finally submitting it, and turning my attention back toward the long, quiet stretch of survey work still ahead of me. Uneventful, all things considered. Continuing mission as planned. I closed the log, dimmed the cabin lights, and let the meridian carry me forward into the dark, already thinking ahead to tomorrow's course correction rather than dwelling on a day that, to me, had simply been another ordinary shift among many, out here where the stars stretch on quietly in every direction, indifferent, patient, and endless.